This recording is a quick overview of the stages of receptive and expressive language development for native English speakers and for children who are learning English as a second language. Actually, it's also the stages that adults who are learning English as a second language would go through. So let's talk about first, for native English speakers, how receptive and expressive language develops for children growing up in an English-speaking environment. There are these stages of language development starting at birth and really culminating in near adult level by school age, although certainly a lot more vocabulary and some complexity the language develops past that time. So let's talk about each one. The age from birth to 1 year old is called the pre-linguistic stage because at this point the baby is preparing to understand and learn words. Speech perception begins. In fact, research shows that babies in the womb will perceive their mother's voices and that they are born primed for the sounds of their native language. Cooing begins in the first few months of life, and babbling starts around 6 months old. And it's somewhere around that time, a few months later, that moms and dads start arguing about whether the baby has said mama or dada first. The age of first words or single word stage begins right around 1 year old. They're almost all object words at first, so cookie, ball. They are what we call hollow phrases, words that signify an entire sentence. So the baby will say cookie to mean give me a cookie. There's approximately 50 words that a young child acquires during this stage of language development. From about 1.5 to 2 years old, the sentences begin to appear. There's a very significant growth in words during that time, and we have what is called telegraphic speech or kernel sentences like mommy's sick. Me home is the story of our grandson. When he was a little toddler, 18 months old, he would stay at our house overnight, and he had a terrible time going to sleep. So we would strap him in his car seat in the back of our truck and wander around the back roads of Winona County trying to help him go to sleep before we fell asleep. One night he was back there going, me home, me home. After about the 10th time, my husband said, me home too. Dead silence for about a minute, and then we heard, me home first. So this was Luke emerging into early sentence stage of language development. The vocabulary words that they acquire in sequence are first nouns, the objects that they started with earlier, and then they begin to have action words like what's happening, and finally descriptors. From age 2 to 2.5, they have short sentences. Sentence grammar begins to develop. They start to have some pronouns, some prepositions like in the box, some helping verbs like he is running. Inflections appear, so they will, instead of dog, they will now say dogs, and they will start to use the past tense, often using words like he goed, which, by the way, reappears in the teenage years. It appears. From 2.5 to 6 year olds is the explosion of language into complete sentence stage. The basic grammar structure of English is completed by 6 years old, and advanced grammatical structures develop. Their speech approaches adult grammar level at this time. They may have some subordinate clauses like after he went home, he rode the bike, some relative clauses and complementary clauses. And in school, the language continues to develop as a communication tool. They are now able to reformulate repeating messages with a change in the sentence structure, and this is where reading and writing begins. So that's a quick tour of language development for native English speakers growing up in an English-speaking environment. Now let's talk briefly about how speakers of other languages acquire English language learners. And as I mentioned before, these English language learners might be young children in our schools. They might be new immigrants who are coming to the United States at the age of 16, 19, even older, many of them not having had any literacy instruction in their home language. So let's look at the stages of second language acquisition. Like a baby learning how to speak, there will be a pre-production stage, and it goes all the way up to advanced fluency, which is total bilingualism. Let's talk about each of them. In stage 1, this is very much like the baby from 0 to 1 year old. This is a silent period. The child or student may have 500 words in his or her receptive vocabulary, but he's not yet speaking, even though he may parrot what is said. Receptively, they will respond to pictures and visuals, and they will understand and duplicate gestures to demonstrate comprehension, which is why total physical response works very well at this level. One thing for teachers to keep in mind is that attentive listening is exhausting. So if some of these students look like they've checked out by afternoon, it may be because they simply do not have the energy to keep listening when there are so few words that they understand, and they have to listen so carefully to try to distinguish specific words from this stream of language that they hear. The second stage is early production. The student is now able to answer yes or no questions. They have a receptive and expressive vocabulary of about 1,000 words, and they stay in this stage usually for about 6 months. This is where they speak in 1-word or 2-word phrases, much like the toddler at 1.5 to 2 years old. They may use some language chunks, but not always correctly. I go bathroom, for example, may be a language piece that they use at this stage. In stage 3, speech emerges, social speech. The vocabulary has now grown to about 3,000 words. The English language learner can use simple phrases and sentences, ask simple questions that aren't always grammatically correct. May I go bathroom? Maybe how he or she asks for permission to go to the bathroom. At this stage, English language learners will understand simple stories if they're read aloud and if they are supported by pictures. This is a wonderful time to use picture books to teach concepts at the middle school and high school level so that the English language learners can understand the science or social studies concepts being presented. And by the way, it definitely helps our native English speakers understand basic concepts better also. In stage 4, English language learners attain what is called intermediate fluency. Their vocabulary now is about 6,000 words. They're beginning to use more complex sentences in speech and writing. They may use some complex sentences, some compound sentences in writing. They can now express their opinions and thoughts and ask questions to clarify classwork. They're usually going to work within their own language to learn content in English. And one of the best things you can do is to allow them to reformulate what they're hearing or working on in their native language. I remember quite a while ago, one of my pre-service teachers indicated that in her student teaching, she would not allow 2 little Spanish boys to talk to each other in Spanish when they were working because they needed to learn English. And I told her that probably it was very important that they do talk to each other in Spanish because that's the way they will learn English better. At this stage, students with support are usually able to do grade level math and science. And then we get to the stage of advanced fluency. This is when they have mastered academic language. While the social language mastery occurs somewhere between 2 to 3 years after being immersed in an English-speaking environment, true academic language does not occur till at least 4 and as long as 10 years. And that's why teachers who see a student who's quite fluent in English may be surprised at the lack of understanding of the high-level academic language that the student needs in order to be successful. They are near native in their ability to complete content area assignments. You're still going to see some difficulties, probably with written syntax and vocabulary. They certainly may have some difficulties with the American penchant for multiple choice tests, which are very, very truncated ways of asking a question requiring high grammar and vocabulary in order to answer. I'm going to give you an example. 2 of our FGI scholars, Latina young women who were doing very, very well in botany zoology last fall, both failed the first multiple choice science test that was given. The instructor was really quite amazed because of their class participation prior to the test. When it was suggested that he give the questions they missed to them orally, he was amazed to find out that both of them missed one question because they didn't know what a rivet was. Once he explained rivet, they got it totally. For another question, one of the young women said, "I can't explain that, but I can draw it." And he said that he saw the most sophisticated drawing of that particular scientific concept that he had ever seen. So that speaks very, very clearly to the need for alternative ways of assessing our students and for that matter, our pre-service teachers and adults who are quite competent in receptive and expressive English, but have difficulty with multiple choice type tests. At the beginning of this advanced fluency stage, students will continue to need teacher support, especially in history and writing, and the difficulty with writing may persist for quite some time. Later in the stage, they're no longer going to need English language learner support programs, although again, content area teachers need to be aware that the way in which they test content may be discriminatory for English language learners. This may be particularly true because recent research shows that if a person is bilingual, that person generally will actually have a lower vocabulary level in both languages. It's as though the space for language vocabulary is reduced somewhat. The research also shows that a bilingual person is always at a disadvantage in very rapid recall of words, even in their native language, but certainly in their second language. And it appears from brain research that when trying to call up a word, that word appears just briefly in both languages, and the brain of a bilingual has to decide which one to use. Certainly, although I don't count myself as fully bilingual anymore, I have experienced that phenomenon when trying to speak both English and Spanish. And so it's something that we as teachers need to be aware of, even when our students appear to be fully bilingual and competent in English as well as their native language. So this concludes our quick tour through language development, first for native speakers of English and for English language learners.